Story time with Stephanie.
Hello, welcome to Story Time. My name is Stephanie Storey, and welcome to my show, Story Time. My guest today, I'm very excited about having here because I am, as people at home may know, I'm trying to expand my definition of writer. And so I asked my friend, Phil Telfeyan, to come here and talk to me about being an attorney. So he is Harvard educated, undergrad in law school, worked in the Harvard Law Review, went and clerked at U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C., yes?
Right.
And then trial attorney for the Civil Rights Department at DOJ, the Department of Justice, before founding his wonderful nonprofit called Equal Justice Under Law in 2014. And they are working to end wealth-based inequality in the criminal justice system, which we will talk about. So welcome to the show, Phil Telfeyan.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for coming on. As I said, I've been trying to expand my definition of what the word writer means outside of just authors. And when I was thinking back through my head about who are the people I know who write a lot and they take it seriously, you came to mind so fast because of the amount of writing you do. So before we get to that, so that we can use examples from your work as we talk about writing, please tell my viewers at home what the work is you do at Equal Justice Under Law.
Great. Absolutely. I'm the founder and executive director of Equal Justice Under Law. It's a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We are focused on systemic reform of the criminal justice system. And our main goal is to end the criminalization of poverty. So we file lawsuits designed to reduce the many ways in which our current justice system punishes people simply for being poor. For example, if you're arrested in the United States, you're held on money bail and you have a price tag for freedom. If you can pay that price tag, you go free before trial. If you can't, you stay in jail. In almost every state, if you get a small court fine or owe some kind of debt to the government, it could be as low as $100. If you can't afford to pay it, they will either jail you or take away your driver's license. So there are so many ways that people are punished just for being poor. And at Equal Justice Under Law, we sue cities, states, counties, governments to prevent this kind of poverty-based discrimination.
Why dedicate your life? Like, this is a serious dedication you have toward an issue, toward really helping people who are poor in this field. Where does that I'm going to call it an obsession. You may disagree with me. Where does that obsession come from for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for every person. For me, I think it comes from sort of a sheltered upbringing. I did not see the pervasive inequality that exists in our society until I was officially an adult. I was 18 and a half when I left my comfortable and lovely home in Sacramento and moved to Harvard for college. I thought I was rich growing up because on Christmas, I would get the first thing on my Christmas list, and my parents honored that. When I went to college, I realized that I had no idea what it meant to be rich. I was literally in the same class as people like Al Gore Jr., Natalie Portman. These are movie stars. These are sons of politicians. Some of the people in my class were of families that the dorms were named after. Their last name was the same as the buildings that we were going to classes in, right? I saw such immense wealth for the first time that I didn't really know existed. And I was 18 years old. And at the same time, for those of you who've been to Boston or Cambridge, right outside of Harvard University, there are dozens and hundreds of people who have no place to live. They sleep on the sidewalk outside the gates of Harvard University and all throughout Cambridge and all throughout Boston. And it was that kind of poverty I had also never seen before. Of course, there are people in Sacramento who are homeless, but I just hadn't seen it. I was kind of a suburban high school kid, never really sort of confronted that reality. And so being an adult and learning about wealth inequality was traumatizing for me. I had grown up thinking, the United States is the greatest country ever, freedom, wealth, consumer economy, obviously has some flaws, but I had gotten the messaging, and then moved to college and saw this really unjustified wealth gap. So that is how wealth inequality first hit me. And now, I guess 19 years later, I'm 37 now, it still sticks with me. You know, I live and work in Washington, D.C., and when I see someone sleeping under an awning or sitting on the sidewalk with a cup asking for loose change, it's really heartbreaking to me. It's devastating that we live in a society that accepts this just extreme poverty when there's so much wealth to go around. So equal justice under law doesn't so much focus on all those issues, which are big and involve pretty broad reforms. We're really focused on the justice system. And my outlook on it is, there's inequality all throughout society. The last place we should see inequality is in the justice system. The justice system is designed to be equal. The very notion of justice and equality go hand in hand for most people. Our name, equal justice under law, is a bit repetitive. If it were unequal, we might not think of it as justice. It's such a pervasive belief that justice should be equal that the name of equal justice under law is simply stolen from the motto of the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. If you look at the Supreme Court building, it says right there on the front, equal justice under law. So it's a concept that to all of us feels like it should be a basic component of the justice system, that people should be treated equally, that someone who's poor should not be punished just because they're poor. And yet throughout our justice system, we see what we call the criminalization of poverty. You're not going to be arrested just for being poor, but being poor leads to so many negative consequences in our justice system that it effectively feels like you'll be arrested just for being poor. And that's a situation that has to end. It's just the tip of the iceberg in inequality in our society, but it's the first most basic form of equality that we really need to see.
This is a really basic question, but I have to ask it. So what are the kinds of writing you do as an attorney regularly?
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, the lawyer's job is writer. So it's interesting when you say expanding your definition of writer. For me as a lawyer, obviously biased, but I feel like all we're doing is writing. There's obviously in-court advocacy. There's in-person dialogue, opposing counsel, judges, juries, etc. But I would say 90% of the work of a lawyer is writing. If you're a civil rights lawyer like me, the first part of the writing involves the lawsuit. I meet with clients face to face. We form a relationship. We get to know each other. I learn about what's happened to this individual. We discuss how the system needs to be changed, and we write the lawsuit. A lawsuit, if well done, tells a story. It explains what's going on in a person's life, what's happening in the system that's causing that harm, and makes that story captivating. A lawsuit, the first document that's filed in court, does not have to be even lawyerly sounding. It doesn't have to have citations, to cases from the 1800s. It doesn't have to have any case citations at all. It just needs to tell the story of what happened. And that's the first thing a judge wants to see is what happened? What are you upset about? And if you don't tell a good story, your lawsuit will never be heard. So that's the first big piece of writing, and maybe the most important. Once the judge agrees to hear your lawsuit, then everything that happens in the case is done in writing. If you want to file a motion to exclude a witness that the opposition is bringing, you need to write out your reasons why. If you want to argue that the judge should expedite consideration of a particular part of the case, you put in writing why. At the end of the case, there's usually a trial, which is what you'll see on TV and in the movies. But what you don't see in the movies is after the trial, almost every judge wants you to put in writing what you think happened during the trial, why you think it's important, and why that means you win. There's what we call a post-trial brief, which is really what moves the judges. They want to see the written summary of how you interpreted all the testimony that was given and everything that happened. So basically everything that happens in law is done through writing, and it's a part of law that most non-lawyers don't see, don't think about, don't even realize is such a huge part of our work.
So you said a few times you're telling stories, which I agree with. Good briefs are good stories. So do you think of yourself as a storyteller? Like, do you go back and go, how am I telling the best story?
Yeah, absolutely. Storytelling is an identity. It's a frame of mind. It's part of why lawyers get a bad reputation, because maybe the negative side of it is spin. You focus on the elements of reality that make the case compelling for your side. and you downplay the facts that aren't as helpful. So spin versus storytelling for lawyers, sometimes it's sort of different views of the same issue. But absolutely, I think of myself as a storyteller. I think of every case that we have, the story needs to be told. And there's all sorts of perspectives that I have to think about as a storyteller. It's sort of like, are you writing your novel from a first-person perspective, where the main character, the protagonist, is also narrating? Are you writing it from a sort of a third-person omniscient perspective, where you're highlighting the story of the protagonist, but you're also drawing on facts that that individual wouldn't know? The perspective you take in legal writing is key, because if what happened to your client is devastating and heartbreaking, but it's not clear who the wrongdoer is, you take the perspective of your client. You just describe what happened. If what happened to your client is bad and what the wrongdoer was doing was evil, you might take more of this third person perspective, where you're looking at the global picture and you want to highlight both. Sometimes what happened to the client itself doesn't seem so bad, but it's the wrongdoer, in our work usually the government, that is awful. So for example, I'll illustrate with one of our areas of focus is expungements. A lot of states will allow you to expunge old criminal record events, but many of them will charge a fee. In some states, it's hundreds of dollars. In Louisiana, it's $550 to expunge an old, this could be decades old, minor conviction. It'll cost
like what? Like name a conviction.
Anything. I mean, our clients, one of them has a DUI, another has a possession of drugs. I mean, these are misdemeanors in almost all cases. They're very low-level offenses because they don't let you expunge more serious offenses. So we're only talking about minor offenses, and only when they're usually 10 years old or older. But if you can't come to $550, you're stuck with that. Well, from the individual's perspective, that story may not sound so sympathetic, right? It's, well, hey, you committed a crime and you're not able to expunge it. Well, you know, okay, so what? When you look at it from the government's perspective, what you see, in my opinion, is something much more discriminatory. They've set up a system where they grant that records should be expunged if they're old and minor, and that this will help the whole state. It'll help people get jobs. It'll help people get apartments. It will improve all aspects of society, and they're only allowing expungement to the wealthy. Why would they do that? What's the logic there? So the lack of any rational motivation on the state's part tends to be the focus of a lawsuit like that, highlighting that the state has got to be rational. It should treat people fairly, and when it behaves arbitrarily or only gives access to the very rich, it's effectively closing off the justice system to a whole aspect of society.
Okay, when you're crafting a brief and you're making this case, like the big major first case, you know, the big major brief that you're first making this case in,
right,
are you thinking about things like stakes and motivation? And I mean, these are all, I'm just thinking of like the plot twists. I mean, are you thinking in like story terms of that nature or not? Like, and then I have a question about persuasive stuff.
Yeah, for me, with the elements of the story that are key are the internal mental states of the characters involved. So the individual that I represent, how is that person approaching this aspect of their lives? How are they receiving the harms done by the government? What impact does it have on them? And what is in the government's mind when they're passing laws that effectively hurt people? You know, I mentioned earlier, most states will take away your driver's license if you can't pay court debt. So you've got all these people who owe $50, $100, $200, small amount of court debt that they can't afford to pay. And in almost every state, they can't drive as a result, even though their court debt probably had nothing to do with driving. It might have been, you know, they didn't mow their lawn and they got a city citation for it, or, you know, didn't put the trash out on the right day or the wrong side of the curb, any kind of fine that you might imagine getting. And these even if they're low-level fines, some people can't afford them and lose their driver's license. It's just a crazy thing to do. And so we try to illustrate what's going on in these people's minds. And our goal is really to get the judge to root for our protagonist, for the person, the human being who is harmed by government practices. They should view it as a conflict, and they should view their being a protagonist and a foil, and someone they're hoping makes it through. And then we make the judge realize that they have an incredible impact on how the story ends. The way our system works is judges have total power. So we give them the first part of the story, and then it becomes a little bit like a choose your own adventure. They decide what the outcome is going to be, and how the story unfolds.
So is the most important element of this kind of persuasive writing that emotional hook in that you're trying to make the judge feel something or think something? Because I always think of a courtroom as being so thinky, as being so heady, less heart, but I may be wrong.
Well, in my opinion, in the federal system, those concepts of thinking and feeling go together. Judges are trained that the rule of law should be logic-based and reason-based. That's something I'm proud of. I like being a lawyer because of its connection to reason. As a result of that training, when you give a judge good reasons for your outcome, that judge will emotionally feel more comfortable with you. They will trust you on an emotional level if you are appealing to logic and reason. So I don't think it's a pure separation. So in some sense, I feel like what I'm doing is emotional appeal. We want this judge to feel moved. The difference, though, is that a judge's emotions often, and frankly, ideally, don't work the way your and my emotions work. Ideally, they're not just swayed by the sob story or, the rhetoric or, what you see in the movies, kind of the flashy language, the pure emotional, what we often think of as a pure emotional appeal, hopefully doesn't work on a judge. You are still reaching their emotions, though, because on an emotional level, a judge wants to feel like they are doing something logical. And I emphasize that logic is just a feeling because lawyers make use of this fact that you can create the feeling of logic, even if what you're doing is actually not logical. You sometimes lawyers never lie, and that's important part of the lawyer's job is you can never lie to a judge. But you present true facts in a way that feels logical, that makes them feel like they want to go along with you, even if true deductive reasoning might leave the question open. So I would say it's sort of both. It's appealing to logic, but in the pursuit of an emotional outcome.
Do you worry about the hook? Like the first sentence. Yeah. I don't know. It was just when you were talking about that, I was like, do you worry about that? Because I worry about the first sentence. So it kills me.
The first sentence is everything. Yeah. I don't know how Moby Dick pulled it off in Call Me Ishmael. It's like, that doesn't seem like the most compelling first sentence to me, but it might very well be the most famous, maybe Tale of Two Cities. There's a few out there. But the first sentence of every document is critical. It's the one that I look at and rewrite the most. And actually the first sentence of sections or chapters within a brief, I also look at closely. The first sentence, it creates the tone. It signals so much in the words you've chosen to use, how long it is, how short it is. I usually tend toward short because I think it will draw the reader in more. But the first sentence is by far the most scrutinized sentence in any piece of writing that I do.
How has your work and the work you're doing, this is a broad question, but I'm just gonna leave it open to you. How is your work and the work you're doing affecting the way you're seeing this latest, all of the protests around George Floyd's murder with the Black Lives Matter movement seeming to gain more traction or more energy, or however you want to think about it at this moment? How is it changing your perspective? And then I have a second question.
Well, I think it's obvious probably to anyone who listened to the first part of this interview that my values are 100% aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the outcomes that the movement is seeking are aligned with my values. So I'll just put that out there as a bias that I'm not neutral on the topic, and I am extremely happy as a civil rights lawyer to see so much of our society focused on inequality in the criminal justice system. So that part is good. That's just my own personal perspective. I am a little worried, and I think my background as a lawyer affects this next comment. Is I'm skeptical or at least cautious that the current movement will actually lead to meaningful change. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, inequality is so deeply entrenched in our society. And for all the people, who have worked on it for centuries and decades and years, much longer than I have, we all know that it rarely changes, sadly. Inequality often takes a different form. One of my role models and heroes, even as a kid, was Thurgood Marshall, who was a lawyer for the NAACP and then a Supreme Court justice. He argued Brown versus Board of Education and persuaded the Supreme Court to end segregation in schools. That was back in the mid 1950s, right? Over, 50, 60 years ago. And if you live in any major city in the United States, certainly here in Washington, D.C., you would scratch your head if someone said that school segregation had ended at one point, because the schools are extremely segregated. So that's just one example of how inequality is so entrenched that even seeming victories often just involve the inequality taking another form. So that's just one inherent skepticism that probably any civil rights lawyer would have. With Black Lives Matter, this is not a new movement. When I founded Equal Justice Under Law in 2014, Black Lives Matter was a big part of my thinking. This was back with Ferguson and Michael Brown's death, another unarmed individual who was killed by cops. So, we've seen problems in the justice system forever, and it wasn't until this really painful to watch killing of George Floyd, where we all see him, life is literally strangled out of him. It happens in slow motion over 8+ minutes on camera. Derek Chauvin, in addition to doing something awful, I hate to say this because it's superficial, he looks awful. I mean, you look at this guy's face and it's you can't help but wonder what's going on in his mind, but it feels evil. I obviously wasn't in his head, so I don't know what was there. But so you're watching this video, you're seeing Derek Chauvin's eyes, you're seeing George Floyd predicting his own death, saying, "I'm going to die, I can't breathe." He's asking for his mom. It's just painful to watch, and it hits you on a really emotional level, as it should, and it hits me on an emotional level. I've watched it a few times, but it's hard every time. First time I'm watching it was a day or two after it was widespread. It was really hard to get through, and I really think that video has kicked off this widespread movement. And so my skepticism is, can a purely emotional experience lead to meaningful reform? And I don't know. In the courtroom, the training of lawyers and judges is that you need facts, logic, and reason to really make someone's mind up. We'll see, I guess, is my only outlook. It's just I really hope our society gets together and realizes it's not just police, it's legislatures, it's the federal Congress, it's judges, it's courts, it's how the whole system, prosecutors, even public defenders, frankly. I mean, the whole system needs radical reform. You look at plea bargaining, where the vast majority of people are overcharged for crimes. Even if they were guilty of something, they're overcharged. They're facing 20-year mandatory minimums or life sentences, and that coerces them into pleading guilty and taking a 10-year sentence. I mean, there's so many aspects. I mean, it doesn't even make sense to start, because there's so many aspects of the justice system that need radical reform. Whether this deeply emotional and painful event that we all saw on video will lead to that change, I hope it does, but I'm nervous, I'm cautious.
I hear you on the skepticism, and I'm highly skeptical too. I mean, we are actually recording this on the day of John Lewis's funeral. And I was thinking about how much work he did in this, and all of the freedom rides and the March on Edmund Pettus Bridge and his career in Congress, all fighting for these kinds of rights. It's been decades and decades, and it's been centuries in this country that we've been fighting for it. If you are as skeptical as I feel sometimes that this may not lead to systemic change, how do you get up the energy every morning to get up and come in and fight the good fight when faced with that kind of external and internal skepticism in your brain?
Yeah, I mean, we only get one life, or so it seems. And if that's the case, this is probably it. So, I mean, I really don't know how long I'll be alive. I guess part of me hopes it's long, but part of me feels that it's much more important what I do with my life and not so much how long it is. So I feel like this is my chance on this planet to try to follow my values, to try to help others, to try to make a difference in society. And I may fail, honestly. I mean, Equal Just Center Law has already won a tremendous number of cases. And I'm not trying to promote my own nonprofit, but we've been incredibly successful across the country, ending money bail pretrial, ending driver's license suspensions, attacking real problems that are affecting thousands of people. But at the end of the day, we really don't know how successful any one of us will be. I feel like the task before us is to try to make that effort. But it's also, frankly, it's a question of values. We all have different priorities in life. I'll say for people listening, I don't have children. I have a family, but it's just me and my romantic partner and our two bunnies. So I think a lot of parents out there will say, it's maybe a little easier to fight a losing battle day after day, and when you don't have human beings that you're responsible for, and that may be true. I don't know, not being a parent myself, but for me, it really feels like a calling, that trying to make a difference, trying to improve the lives of others, and really it's reducing what I still think is an unjustified inequality in our system. That to me is a daily action. So when I walk around Washington D.C., every time someone asks for money, I give them $1. I keep my wallet stuffed with singles. I have to go. I've never had alcohol before, but I frequently pop into bars because they always have singles. Because whatever, tip jars and drinks or whatever, and I'm always asking for change. And it's a very small thing. That's not going to eliminate inequality, but it just reminds me that this fight is a daily, even momentary, moment-to-moment gesture that has to be reinforced. But I think everyone else has their own life calling, and I think part of the beauty of the life we have is we get to decide what that calling is for ourselves. No one else gets to pick that for us. A lot of parents try, I think, to pick it for their own kids, but we get to shape our own path through life. And for me, I think that I will, if my death is not sudden, if there's a deathbed, I think I'll be able to feel like as long as I tried my best, then I did what I should have.
Okay, I do have to ask one more question. Behind you are pictures of places you have traveled, and you have taken those photographs.
Yes.
You are also a charity magician. You perform magic for charities.
Yep.
And you take photographs at particularly national parks.
Yep.
Because you're obsessed with national parks. Okay. What have either or both of those things taught you about the way you tell stories, or have they in any way that affects the way you actually do your work?
There's a couple other interests I have that you didn't name. I don't know if viewers can see here is a subway map. You can see a small part of it. I also love subways and public transportation. Basically what I've learned in my life is that I like things that almost everyone likes. I also love bowling, right? And bowling is one of those sports where you could be 4 years old, you could be 94 years old. It's fun for all ages, I tend to love things very passionately for whatever reason. I've been to every single national park, most of them 2 or 3 or 4 times in the country. I hike extensively. And so I think what it's taught me is that passion makes life better. When you're passionate about things, they tend to be more rewarding to you, rightly or wrongly. I'm passionate about bowling, which most people think is a very silly activity, but I travel with my own bowling ball and my own shoes. When I came down to Arkansas to visit your family's, I brought my bowling ball and actually bowled my highest ever score in Hot Springs, Arkansas. So I was glad I had my ball with me. Doesn't seem like what most people want to do on a vacation, but yeah, I think being passionate about things tends to make them better for my own life. But it also tends to make the people you're talking to care more about them. Hopefully some of you right now are thinking, hey, I'll go bowling with my friends right now. That sounds like fun. Phil was just talking about it and he seemed excited about it, right? So when you bring passion to things, it makes it better for you. It also tends to make others a little more interested to see things from your perspective. And so in writing, I care a lot about injustice and inequality, and on the flip side, justice and equality. And if that passion is part of the writing, hopefully whoever's reading it will feel it. They'll feel that at least one person, whoever wrote this document that I'm reading, really cares about inequality. And that sort of makes them feel it a little bit too. I mean, that's in all of us. Inequality is not such a niche thing that some people haven't heard of it. And we all feel it on some level. And so when you write passionately about it, I do think it tends to engage the reader more. And so as a writer, and this is a big thing for lawyers, I do no copy paste. It doesn't, most lawyers, if they've seen an issue before, they'll say, oh, I learned, I did that 2 years ago. I'll pull up that motion and just change the names. I think that's a really bad practice. If you are not fully present in what you've written, I think your reader needs to feel like you wrote this for them.
You're present in the moment. I loved that. And the passion.
Yeah.
And that's all key. And these are three of the reasons why I think you're one of the greatest humans on the planet. So thank you for doing the work that you do, Phil, because it's changing the world and making the world a better place. And that is so important. Thank you for joining me and humoring my conversation about writing. I so appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's really been cool to be on this show, and it's been cool to be a viewer of the show. I love all the guests that you bring on. So I hope that people are inspired to read Oil and Marble and Raphael. And
that's nice. Look, now you're plugging my stuff.
I should say, I'm not going to give away any surprises, but I think Oil and Marble does a great job of illustrating this logic emotion dynamic as well that I was talking about with judges. So a little teaser for people who haven't read it.
I think I know which parts and who maybe you're talking about. Okay, good. All right. Thank you, Phil, for joining me. I appreciate it. And thank you for everything you do. And everybody else, see you next time. Bye.
With Stephanie story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.